Carson opened his eyes and found himself looking upwards into a flickering blue dimness. It was hot and he was lying on sand, and a rock embedded in the sand was hurting his back. He rolled over to his side off the rock and then pushed himself up to a sitting position. I'm crazy or dead or something. The sand was blue, bright blue. There wasn't any such thing as bright blue sand on Earth or any other planet. Blue sand under a blue dome. There wasn't the sky nor yet a room, but a circumscribed area, and somehow we knew it was circumscribed and finite, even though he couldn't see the top of it. He picked up some of the sand in his hand and let it run through his fingers and trickle down onto his bare legs. Bare? Yes, he was stark naked, and already his body was dripping perspiration from the enervating heat, coated blue with sand wherever sand had touched it. And elsewhere, his body was white. He thought, this sand is really blue. If it seemed blue only because of the blue light, then I'd be blue also, but I'm white. So the sand is blue. Blue sand. There isn't any blue sand. There isn't any place like this place that I'm in. Sweat was running down his eyes. It was hot. The hell of the ancients type of hot. But if this place wasn't hell, what was it? Only Mercury among the planets had heat like this, and this wasn't Mercury. Mercury was some 4 billion miles from... It came back to him then, where he'd been. In the little one-man scouter outside the orbit of Pluto, scouting a scant 1,000,000 miles to one side of the Earth armada, drawn up in battle array there to intercept the outsiders. Then sudden strident ringing of the alarm when the rival scouter and the outer ship had come within range of his detectors. No one knew who the outsiders were, what they looked like, or from what galaxy they came from, other than that it was in the general direction of Pleiades. First, there have been sporadic raids on Earth colonies and outposts, isolated battles between Earth patrols and small groups of outsider spaceships. Battles sometimes won and sometimes lost, but never resulting in the capture of an alien vessel. Nor had any member of a raided colony ever survived to describe the outsiders who had left the ships, if indeed they had left them. Not too serious a menace at first, for the raids had not been numerous or destructive, and individually, the ships had proved slightly inferior in armament to the best of Earth's fighters, although somewhat superior in speed and maneuverability. A sufficient edge in speed, in fact, to give the outsiders their choice of running or fighting unless surrounded. And nevertheless, Earth had prepared for some serious trouble, building the mightiest armada of all time. It had been waiting now, that armada, for a long time. And now the showdown was coming. Scouts, 20 billion miles out, had detected the approach of a mighty fleet of the outsiders. And those scouts had never come back. But their radiotronic messages had, and now Earth's armada, all 10,000 ships and 500,000 fighting spacemen, was out there, outside Pluto's orbit, waiting to intercept and battle to the death. And an even battle it was going to be. Judging by the advance of reports, the men of the far picket line who had seen their reports before they had died on the size and strength of the alien fleet, anybody's battle, with the mastery of the solar system hanging in the balance on an even chance. At last, and only chance for Earth and all her colonies, lay in the utter mercy of the outsiders if they ran the gauntlet. Bob Carson remembered now. He remembered that strident bell and his leap for the control panel. His frenzied fumbling as he strapped himself into the seat, the dot on the visiplate that grew larger, the dryness in his mouth, the awful knowledge that this was it for him, at least, although the main fleets were still out of range of one another. This His first taste of battle. And within 3 seconds or less, he'd be victorious or a charred cinder. One hit completely took care of a lightly armed and armored one-man craft like a scouter. Frantically, as his lips shaped the word "one," he worked at the controls to keep that growing dot centered on the cross spider webs of the visiplate. His hands doing that, while his right foot hovered over the pedal that would fire the bolt, the single bolt of concentrated hell that had to hit, or else there wouldn't be time for any second shot. He didn't know what he'd said either when he said 2. The dot on the visiplate wasn't a dot, no. Only a few thousand miles away, it showed up in the magnification of the plates as though it were only a few hundred yards off. It was a fast little scouter, about the size of his. An alien ship. All right. His foot touched the bolt release pedals. And then the outsider had swerved suddenly and was off the crosshairs, and Carson punched keys frantically to follow. For a tenth of a second, it was out of the visiplate entirely, and then as the nose of his scouter swung after it, he saw it again, diving straight towards the ground. It was an optical illusion of some sort, it had to be. That planet, or whatever it was that now covered the visiplate, couldn't be there. Couldn't possibly. There wasn't any planet nearer than Neptune, 3 billion miles away, with Pluto on the opposite side of the distant pinpoint sun. His detectors, they hadn't shown any object of planetary dimensions, even of asteroid dimensions, and still didn't. It couldn't be there. Whatever it was, he was diving into. And only a few hundred miles, it was below him. In the sudden anxiety to keep from crashing, he forgot the outsider's ship. He fired the front-braking rockets, and even as the sudden change of speed slammed him forward against the seat straps, fired full right for an emergency turn. Pushed them down, held them down, knowing that he needed everything the ship had to keep from crashing, and that a turn that sudden would black him out for a moment. And it did. It blacked him out, and that was all. And now he was sitting in hot blue sand, stark naked, but otherwise unhurt. No sign of his spaceship, and for that matter, no sign of space. The curve overhead wasn't the sky, whatever it was. And so he scrambled to his feet. Gravity seemed a little more than Earth. Not much more, flat sand stretching away, a few scrawny bushes and clumps here and there. The bushes were blue too, but in a varying shade, some lighter than the blue of the sand and some darker. And out from under the nearest bush ran a little thing that was like a lizard, except that it had more than 4 legs. And it was blue too, bright blue. It saw him and ran back under the bush, and he looked up again, trying to decide what was overhead. It wasn't exactly a roof, but it was dome-shaped, and it flickered and was hard to look at. But definitely it curved down to the ground, to the blue sand, all around him. He wasn't far from being under the center of the dome. At a guess, it was 100 yards to the nearest wall, if it was a wall. It was as though a blue hemisphere of something about 250 yards in circumference was inverted over the flat expanse of the sand, and everything blue. Except one object. Over near a far curving wall there was a red object. Spherical, it seemed to be about a yard in diameter. Too far for him to clearly see through flickering blueness, but unaccountably he shuddered. He wiped sweat from his forehead, or tried to, with the back of his hand. Was this a dream? A nightmare? This heat, the sand, that vague feeling of horror he felt when he looked toward the red thing. A dream? No one. No one didn't go to sleep and dream in the midst of a battle, did they? Death? No, never. If there were immortality, it wouldn't be a senseless thing like this. A thing of blue heat and blue sand and red horror. And then he heard the voice. Inside his head. He heard it, not with his ears. It came from nowhere, or everywhere. Through space and dimensions wandering. And in this space and this time, I find two people about to exterminate one, and so weaken the other that it would retrogress and never fulfill its destiny, but decay and return to mindless dust whence it came. I say, this must not happen. What are you? You would not understand completely, I am. There was a pause, as though the voice sought in Carson's brain for a word that wasn't there, a word he didn't know. I am the end of evolution of a race so old, the time cannot be expressed in the words that have meaning to your mind. A race fused into a single entity, an entity such as your primitive race might become. Time for now. So might the race you call in your mind the Outsiders. So I intervene in the battle to come, the battle between fleets so evenly matched that destruction of both races will result. But one of you must survive. One must progress, evolve. One. Mine. In my power it is to stop the war, to send the Outsiders back to their galaxy, but they would return. Of your race would sooner or later follow them there. Only by remaining in this space and time to intervene constantly could I prevent them from destroying one another. And I cannot remain. So I shall intervene now. I shall destroy one fleet completely without the loss of the other. One civilization shall thus survive. But this has to be a nightmare. But Carson knew it wasn't. It was too mad, too impossible to be anything but real. He didn't dare ask the question, but his thoughts asked it for him. The strongest shall survive. That I cannot and would not change. I merely intervene to make it a complete victory. Not a Pyrrhic victory to a broken race. From the outskirts of the not yet battle I plucked two individuals. You and an outsider. I see from your mind that in your early history of nationalisms, battles between champions to decide issues between races were not unknown. You and your opponent are here, pitted against one another, naked and unarmed, under conditions equally unfamiliar to you both, equally unpleasant to you both. There's no time limit. For here, there is no time. The survivor is the champion of his race, and that race survives. But Carson's protest was too inarticulate for expression, but the voice answered it. It is fair. The conditions are such that the accident of physical strength will not completely decide the issue. There is a barrier. You will understand. Brain power and courage will be more important than strength, most especially courage, which is the will to survive. But while this goes on, the fleets will know. You are in another space, another time. For as long as you are here, time stands still in the universe you know. I see you wonder whether the place is real. It is. And it is not. As I, to your limited understanding, am not real, and I am. My existence is mental, not physical. You saw me as a planet. It could have been a dust mote or a sun, but to you this place is now real. What you suffer here will be real. And if you die here, your death will be real. If you die, your failure will be the end of your race. That is enough for you to know. And then, the voice was gone. And again he was alone. But not alone. For as Carson looked up, he saw that the red thing, the sphere of horror that he now knew, was the outsider, rolling. It seemed to have no legs or arms that he could see, no features. It rolled across the sand with the fluid quickness of a drop of mercury, and before it, in some manner he could not understand, came a wave of nauseating hatred. And Carson looked about him frantically. A stone, lying in the sand a few feet away, was the nearest thing to a weapon. It wasn't large, but it had sharp edges, like a slab or a flint. It looked a bit like a blue flint, and he picked it up and crouched to receive the attack. It was coming fast, faster than he could run. No time to think out how he was going to fight it. How, any way, could he plan to battle a creature whose strength, whose characteristics, whose method of fighting he did not know? Rolling so fast, it looked more than ever like a perfect sphere. 10 yards away, 5, and then it stopped. Or rather, it was stopped. Abruptly, the near side of it flattened as though it had run up against an invisible wall. It bounced. It actually bounced back. Then it rolled forward again, but more cautiously it stopped again. At the same place, it tried again, a few yards to one side. Then it rolled forward again, but more cautiously it stopped. The same place, and it tried again, a few yards to one side. There was a barrier of some sort there. A force field, of course. Not the Nietzschean field known to the earth science, for that glowed and emitted a crackling sound. This one was invisible, silent. It was a wall that ran from side to side on the inverted hemisphere. Carson didn't have to verify that himself. The roller was doing that, rolling sideways along the barrier, seeking a break in it that wasn't there. Carson took a dozen steps forward. His left hand, groping out before him, touched the barrier. It was smooth and yielding, like a sheet of rubber rather than like glass, warm to the touch. He dropped the stone and put both hands against it, pushing. It seemed to yield. It felt like a sheet of rubber, backed up the steel, limited resiliency and then firm strength. The roller was coming back again. Obviously, it couldn't find a way through either side, and the roller was back now, and it stopped just across the barrier, only 6 feet away. It seemed to be studying him, although for the life of him, Carson couldn't find external evidence of sense organs on the thing. Nothing that looked like eyes or ears or even a mouth. There was, though, he observed, a series of grooves. Perhaps a dozen of them. The tentacles it had were retractable into the grooves, and were kept there except when in use. They retracted when the thing rolled, and seemed to have nothing to do with its method of locomotion. That, as far as Carson could judge, seemed to be accomplished by some shifting, but just how he couldn't imagine. He shuddered as he looked at the thing. It was alien. Horribly different from anything on Earth or any of the life forms found on the other solar planets. Instinctively, he knew its mind was as alien as its body. It could project that almost tangible wave of hatred. Perhaps it could read its mind as well, sufficiently at least for its purposes. Deliberately, Carson picked up the rock that had been his only weapon and tossed it down again in a gesture of relinquishment, and raised his empty hands, palms up. Can we not have peace between us? The entity who brought us here told us what must happen if our races fight. Extinction of one, weakening and retrogression of the other. The battle between them, said the entity, depends on what we do here. Why cannot we agree to an eternal peace? Your race to its galaxy, and we to ours. Carson blanked out his mind to receive a reply. It came and it staggered him back. Physically, he recoiled several steps in sheer horror at the intensity of the lust to kill of the red images projected at him. For a moment that seemed eternity, he had to struggle against the impact of that hatred, fighting to clear his mind of it and drive out the alien thoughts to which he had given admittance. He wanted to retch. Okay, so it's war then? If I got your answer straight, peace doesn't appeal to you. Well, to the death. But his voice in that other silence sounded silly even to himself. It came to him then that this was to the death. Not only his own death or that of the red spherical thing which he thought of as the roller, but death to the entire race of one or the other of them. He stared at it and endeavored to concentrate and focus all his thought upon it. Die. You're going to die. You, in fact, are dying now. You are. He was able to drive the thoughts of the roller out of his mind. If its ability to project were stronger, might not its receptivity mechanisms be more vulnerable? No. On the whole, it didn't look too hard to handle physically. Unless, of course, that bush was made of pretty tough stuff. Carson looked around. Within reach was another bush of identically the same type. He snapped off a twig. It was brittle, easy to break. Of course, the roller might have been faking deliberately, but he didn't think so. On the other hand, where was it vulnerable? How would he go about killing it if he got the chance? He went back to studying it. The outer hide looked pretty tough. He'd need a sharp weapon of some sort. He picked up the piece of rock again. It was about 12 inches long, narrow, fairly sharp on one end. If it chipped like flint, he could make a serviceable knife out of it. He sat up, shaking his head to clear it, and he saw something coming through the air towards him. He threw himself flat again on the sand. Why not? Why should the entity who thought of this nightmare of a place not have a sense of humor, along with the other powers it has? He grinned at the lizard nearby. Come on over. But the lizard turned and ran away, scurrying from bush to bush until it was out of sight. All in all, he still had to get past the barrier. He couldn't get through it, over it, but he was certain he could get under it. And come to think of it, didn't one sometimes find water by digging? Painfully now, Carson limped up to the barrier and started digging, scooping up sand a double handful at a time. It was slow work because the sand ran in at the edges, and the deeper he got, the bigger in diameter the hole had to be. How many hours it took him, he didn't know, but He hit bedrock 4 feet down, dry bedrock, with no sign of water. The force field of the barrier went down clear to the bedrock. He crawled out of the hole and lay there panting, and then raised his head to look across and see what the roller was doing. It was making something out of wood from the bushes, tied together with tendrils. A shape, a framework about 4 feet high and roughly square. To see it better, Carson climbed onto the mound of sand he had excavated and stood there staring. There were 2 long levers sticking out of the back of it, one with a cup-shaped affair on the end. Seemed to be some sort of catapult. And sure enough, the roller was lifting a sizable rock into the cup shape, and one of his tentacles moved the other lever up and down for a while. Then he turned the machine slightly, aiming it, and the lever with the stone flew up and forward. The stone curved several yards over Carson's head, so far that he didn't have to duck, but he judged the distance it had traveled and whistled softly. He couldn't throw a rock that weight more than half that distance, and even retreating to the rear of his domain wouldn't put him out of range of that machine if the roller pushed it forward towards the barrier. Another rock whizzed over, not quite so far away this time, and moving from side to side along the barrier so the catapult couldn't bracket him. He hurled a dozen rocks at it, but that wasn't going to be any good. They had to be light rocks, or he couldn't throw them that far. If they hit the framework, they bounced off harmlessly. The roller had no difficulty at that distance in moving aside from those that came near it. Besides, his arm was tiring badly and he ached all over. He stumbled to the rear of the arena. Even that wasn't any good. The rocks reached back there too, only there were long intervals between them, as though it took longer to wind up the mechanism, whatever it was, of the catapult. And wearily, he dragged himself back to the barrier again, and several times he fell and could barely rise to his feet to go on. He knew, near the end of the limit of his endurance. Yet, he didn't dare stop moving now, until and unless he could put that catapult out of action. If he fell asleep, he'd never wake up. One of the stones from it gave him the glimmer of an idea. It hit one of the piles of stones he'd gathered near the barrier to use as ammunition and struck a spark. Sparks. Fire. Primitive man had made fire by striking sparks, and with some of those dry, crumbly bushes as tinder. A bush of that type grew near him. He uprooted it, took it over to the pile of stones, then patiently hit one stone against another until a spark touched the punk-like wood of the brush. It went up in flames so fast that it singed his eyebrows and was burned to ash within seconds. But he had the idea now, and within minutes he had a little fire going in the lee of the mound of sand he'd made. The tender bushes started it, and other bushes which burned slowly kept it at a steady flame. The tough tendrils didn't burn readily. They made the fire bombs easy to rig and throw. A bundle of wood tied about a small stone to give it weight, and a loop of tendrils to swing it by. He made half a dozen of them before he lighted and threw the first. It went wide, and the rollers started a quick retreat, pulling the catapult after him. But Carson had the others ready and threw them in rapid succession, and the fourth wedged into the catapult's framework, and it did the trick. The roller tried desperately to put out the spreading blaze by throwing sand, but its clawed tentacles would take only a spoonful at a time, and its efforts were ineffectual. The catapult burned. The roller moved safely away from the fire, and seemed to concentrate its attention on Carson. And again, he felt that wave of hatred and nausea, but weaker than the last time. Either the roller itself was weakening, for Carson had learned how to protect himself against the mental attack. He thumbed his nose at it, and then sent it scuttling back to safety with a stone. The roller went back to the back of its half of the arena and started pulling up bushes again. Probably it was going to make another catapult. Carson verified that the barrier was still operating, and then found himself sitting in the sand beside it, suddenly too weak to stand up. His legs throbbed steadily now, and the pangs of thirst were severe, but those things paled beside the physical exhaustion that gripped his entire body. Hell must be like this, the hell that the ancients had believed in. He fought to stay awake, and yet staying awake seemed futile. For there was nothing he could do while the barrier remained impregnable, and the roller stayed back out of range. He tried to remember what he had read in books of archaeology about the methods of fighting used back in the days before metal and plastic. The stone missile had come first, he thought. Well, that he already had. Bow and arrow? No. He tried archery once and knew his own ineptness, even with a modern sportsman's Durasteel weapon. With only the crude, pieced-together outfit he could make here, he doubted he could shoot as far as he could throw a rock. Spear? No, he could make that. It would be useless at a distance, but would be handy if things became close range, if he ever got there. Making one would help his mind from wandering, as it was beginning to. He was still beside one of the piles of stones, and he sorted through it until he found one shaped roughly like a spearhead. With a smaller stone, he began to chip it into shape, fashioning sharp shoulders on the side so that it penetrated it, not pull out again like a harpoon. A harpoon was better than a spear, maybe, for this crazy contest. If he could once get it into the roller and had a rope on it, he could pull the roller up against the barrier, and the stone blade of his knife would reach through the barrier, even if his hands didn't. The shaft was harder to make than he had expected at the head, but by splitting and joining the main stems of 4 of the brushes, and wrapping the joints with the tough but thin tendrils, he got a strong shaft about 4 feet long, and tied the stone head in a notch cut in one end. It was crude, but it was strong. And with the tendrils, he made himself 20 feet a line. It was light. Didn't look strong, but he knew it would hold his weight. He tried one end of it to the shaft of the harpoon, and the other end around his right wrist. At least he knew this harpoon would cross the barrier, and he'd be able to pull it back if he missed. He tried to stand up, to see what the roller was doing, and found he couldn't get to his feet. And on the 3rd try, he got as far as his knees and then fell flat again. I've got to sleep. But if a showdown came now, I'd be helpless. He could come up here and kill me if he knew. I've got to regain some strength. And slowly, painfully, he crawled back from the barrier. The jar of something thudding against the sand near him weakened him from a confused and horrible dream to a more confused and horrible reality. And he opened his eyes again to blue radiance over blue sand. How long had he slept? A minute, a day. Another stone thudded nearer, threw sand on him. He got his arms under him and sat up. He turned round and saw the roller 20 yards away, at the barrier. It rolled off hastily and he sat up, not stopping until it was far away as it could get. He'd fallen asleep too soon, he realized. While he was still in range of the roller's throwing, Seeing him lying motionlessly, it had dared come up to the barrier, and luckily it didn't realize how weak he was, or it could have stayed there and kept on throwing stones. He started crawling again, this time forcing himself to keep going, until he was as far as he could go, until the opaque wall of the arena's outer shell was only a yard away. Then, things slipped away again. And when he awoke, nothing about him was changed. But this time, he knew he had slept for a long while. First thing he became aware of was the inside of his mouth. It was dry, caked, his tongue was swollen. Something was wrong, and he knew. And as he returned slowly to full awareness, he felt less tired. The stage of utter exhaustion had passed, but there was pain. Agonizing pain. It wasn't until he tried to move that he knew that it came from his leg. He raised his head and looked at it. It was swollen below the knee, and the swelling showed even halfway up to his thigh. The plant tendrils he had tied round the protective pad of leaves now cut deeply into his flesh. To get his knife under that embedded lashing would have been impossible. Fortunately, the final knot was over the shin bone. With a vine cut in less deeply than elsewhere, he was able, after an effort, to untie the knot. A look under the pad of leaves showed him the worst. Infection, blood poisoning. Without drugs, without even water, there wasn't a thing he could do about it, except die when the poison spread through his system. He knew it was hopeless. He knew he'd lost, and with him, humanity. And when he died here, out there in the universe, he knew all his friends, everybody would die too. Earth and the colonized planets would become the home of the red rolling alien outsiders. It was that thought which gave him courage to start crawling, almost blindly, toward the barrier again, pulling himself along by his arms and hands. There was a chance in a million that he'd have strength left when he got there to throw his harpoon spear just once, and with deadly effect, if the roller would come up to the barrier, or if the barrier was gone. It took him years, it seemed, to get there. The barrier wasn't gone. It was as impassable as when he'd first felt it. The roller wasn't at the barrier. By raising himself up at his elbows, he could see it at the back of its part of the arena, working on a wooden framework that was half completed, duplicate of the catapult he destroyed. It was moving slowly now. Undoubtedly, it had weakened too, and Carson doubted that it would ever need that second catapult. He'd be dead before it was finished. His mind must have slipped for a moment, for he found himself beating his fists against the barrier in futile rage. Made himself stop. He closed his eyes, tried to make himself calm. "Hello," said a voice. It was small, it was thin. He opened his eyes and turned his head. It was a lizard. "Go away. Go away. You're not really there. Or you're there, but not really talking. I'm imagining things again." But he couldn't talk. His throat and tongue were past all speech with dryness. He closed his eyes again. Hurt, kill, kill, hurt, come. He opened his eyes again. The blue, tin-legged lizard was standing there. It ran a little way along the barrier, came back, started off again, and came back. Hurt, kill, come. Again it started off and came back. Obviously, it wanted Carson to follow it along the barrier. He closed his eyes again. The voice kept on. The same three meaningless words each time he opened his eyes. Hurt, kill, come. Carson groaned. Since there would be no peace unless he followed this thing, he crawled after it. Another sound, a high-pitched squealing, came to his ears. There was something lying in the sand, writhing, squealing, something small, blue, that looked like a lizard. He saw it was the lizard whose legs the roller had pulled off earlier. It wasn't dead. It had come back to life and was wriggling and screaming in agony. Hurt, kill, said the other lizard. Carson understood. He took the flint knife from his belt and killed the tortured creature. The live lizard scurried off. Carson turned back to the barrier. He leaned his hand and head against it and watched the roller, far back, working on the new catapult. I could get that far, if I could get through. If I could get through, I might win yet. It looks weak too, I might. And then there was another reaction of hopelessness, when pain sapped his will and wished that he were dead, envying the lizard he just killed. It didn't have to live on and suffer. He was pushing on the barrier with the flat of his hand, when he noticed his arm was thin and scrawny. He must really have been here a long time, days, to get this thin. And for a while he was almost hysterical again. And then came a time of deep calm and thought. The lizard he had just killed had crossed the barrier. Still alive. It had come from the roller's side. The roller had pulled off its legs and then tossed it. It hadn't been dead, merely unconscious. A live lizard shouldn't be able to go through the barrier. But an unconscious one could. The barrier was not a barrier then to living flesh, but to conscious flesh. It was a mental protection, a mental hazard. And with that thought, Carson started crawling along the barrier to make his last desperate gamble. A hope so forlorn that only a dying man could have dared try it. He moved along the barrier to the mound of sand about 4 feet high, which he'd scooped out while trying, how many days ago, to dig under the barrier to reach water. Taking with him a rock from the pile nearby, he climbed up to the top of the dune and lay there against the barrier so that the barrier were taken away. He'd roll on down the short slope into the enemy territory. He checked to be sure that the knife was safely in his rope belt, that the harpoon was in the crook of his left arm, and the 20-foot rope fastened to it and to his wrist. Then with his right hand he raised the rock, with which he would hit himself on the head, and luck would have to be with him on that blow. It would have to be hard enough to knock him out, but not hard enough to knock him out for long. He had a hunch that the roller was watching him, and would see him roll down through the barrier and come to investigate. He would believe he was dead, he hoped. He thought it was probably drawn, the same deduction about the nature of the barrier as he had. He struck himself, and pain brought him back to consciousness, a sudden sharp pain in his hip that was different from the pain in his head and leg. He had, thinking things out before he had struck himself, anticipated that very pain, even hoped for it, and had steeled himself against awakening with a sudden movement. He opened his eyes, just a slit, and saw that he had guessed rightly. The roller was coming closer. It was 20 feet away. The pain had awakened him. He lay still. It came closer, 15 feet away. Stopped again. Carson scarcely breathed. As nearly as possible, he was keeping his mind blank, lest his telepathic abilities detect consciousness in him. And with his mind blanked out all the way, the impact of its thoughts upon his mind was shattering. He felt sheer horror at the alienness, the differentness of those thoughts, conveying things that he felt but could not understand or express. Because no terrestrial language had words, no terrestrial brain had images to fit them. The mind of a spider, he thought, or the mind of a praying mantis, or a Martian sand serpent. He understood now that the entity had been right. Man or roller. The universe was not a place that could hold both. And closer, Carson waited until it was only feet away, until it clawed, tentacles reaching out. Oblivious to agony now, he sat up, raised and flung the harpoon with all the strength that remained in him, and as the roller, deeply stabbed by the harpoon, rolled away, Carson tried to get to his feet to run after it. He couldn't do that. He fell, but kept crawling. It reached the end of the rope. He was jerked forward by the pull on his wrist, and it dragged him. Stone knife in hand, he met it. He stabbed, again and again, while those horrid claws ripped skin and flesh and muscle from his body. He stabbed and slashed. And at last, it was still. A bell was ringing, and it took him a while after he'd opened his eyes to tell where he was. He was strapped into the seat of his scouter, and the visit plate before him showed only empty space. No outsider ship. No impossible planet. The bell was the communications plate signal, and someone wanted him to switch power into the receiver. Magellan to Carson. Come in. The fight's over. We've won. The screen went blank, and slowly Carson set the controls for return. And slowly, unbelievingly, he unstrapped himself from the seat and went back to get a drink at the cold water tank. He leaned there against the wall, trying to think. Had it happened? He was in good health, sound, uninjured. His thirst had been mental rather than physical. His throat hadn't been dry. He pulled up his trouser leg and looked at the calf. There was a long, white scar there, but a perfectly healed scar, and it hadn't been there before. But it had happened. The scouter under automatic control was already entering the hatch of the mothership. The grapples pulled it into the individual lock, and a moment later a buzzer indicated that the lock was air-filled. Hi, Carson. What you missed. What a show. What happened, sir? Don't know exactly. We fired one salvo, and their whole fleet went up in the dust. Whatever it was jumped from ship to ship like a flash. Even the ones we hadn't aimed at. The ones that were out of range. I can't even take credit for it. Must have been some unstable component in the metal they used. It's too bad you missed all the excitement. Yes, sir. It's too bad I missed all the excitement.